Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating tug-of-war over the American founding. On one side, you have this sweeping, heroic narrative that's designed to inspire, and on the other, a rigorous academic critique that digs into the messy and sometimes uncomfortable realities of our past. Let's unpack it.
But before we really get going, I want you to ask yourself something. Is history just a dusty record of the past, or is it actually an argument about who we are today? Because as we go through the source material, it becomes pretty clear that when we debate the founding of the United States, we're actually debating our present identity.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the battle for history, the providential narrative, critiquing the heroic view, scripture and the sword, church versus nation, and finally, how we consume history. Let's jump right in. All right, Section 1, the battle for history, America's 250th. Consider this quote from Eric Metaxas. Notice that framing right at the start, once upon a time. It literally sets up the American founding like a fairy tale, complete with noble heroes and despicable villains. It's an interpretation meant to be deeply moving, suggesting that believing in this heroic story is absolutely essential to our future. Moving right along to Section 2, the providential narrative, faith and liberty. This idea builds into what's often called the golden triangle of freedom. You can kind of think of it like a three-legged stool. According to this narrative, the founders believed that for a republic to survive, you couldn't just have rules. You needed good people. And to have good people, you needed religion. If one leg breaks, the whole thing falls apart. So, the big takeaway from this really inspirational perspective is that liberty isn't just on autopilot. It needs perpetual dedication. The argument here is that by celebrating the monumental figures of 1776, you, the modern citizen, can reignite a patriotic love that's necessary to keep the republic alive. Now, let's look at the other side in Section 3, critiquing the heroic view, historical reality. Because when we actually dig into the historical records, there's a bit of a plot twist. Popular myth tells us the Pilgrims were all about universal religious freedom, but the reality is they weren't exactly handing out coexist bumper stickers. In Plymouth Colony, there were strict fines for missing public worship, and Quakers were actually banished. The modern concept of religious liberty is quite different from how they actually lived. And it goes further. Instead of just blindly trusting in the virtue of the public, the framers of the Constitution were actually pretty skeptical of human nature. The academic sources note that while the founders hoped for the best, they definitely expected the worst. That's exactly why they built such elaborate checks and balances to prevent the abuse of power by the government and the people. Which brings us to Section 4, Scripture and the Sword, Religion in War. James Bird's research is super interesting here. It reveals that colonial ministers leaned heavily on the Old Testament, basically retrofitting Scripture to build patriotic zeal. The story of Exodus became a direct parallel for British tyranny. David and Goliath, that represented the outgunned colonists facing the mighty British Empire. Even New Testament passages were reinterpreted, framing resistance to a tyrant not just as a political right, but as a religious duty. But historians caution that this kind of rhetoric rapidly morphed the conflict. It went from being a just war into a full-blown holy crusade. Mark Knoll's research points out that the cause of America was repeatedly described as the cause of Christ. The concern here? That this revolutionary fervor might have caused a momentary moral collapse, replacing absolute loyalty to God with unwavering loyalty to a political cause. Let's unpack that in Section 5, Church versus Nation, Theological Implications. A really prime example of this blurring of lines is John Winthrop's famous "Shining City on a Hill" speech. We hear this used all the time today to describe America in near messianic terms, but the academic sources clarify a pretty surprising fact. Winthrop wasn't prophesying a great nation-state. He was simply delivering a stern warning to his local 1630 congregation that their behavior, whether it was good or bad, would be visible to everyone. You can see this conflation perfectly in quotes from the providential perspective, which sometimes literally claim the gospel's primary effect was forging an American people. The source material highlights this as a profound blurring of lines, taking a spiritual message and framing its ultimate achievement as the creation of a geopolitical nation. Now, that highly evocative viewpoint stands in pretty jarring contrast to academic critics like Hugh Heclo, who warn that treating a nation as a sacred, chosen entity borders on blasphemy. Scholars argue that if you impart absolute sacredness to a nation, you lose the ability to view its history objectively, making it almost impossible to recognize the genuine faults of the past. And finally, Section 6. How we consume history, media, and the past. When we look at Hollywood films, like, say, The Free State of Jones, experts point out a massive risk. We often confuse heavily dramatized narratives for factual reality. Film is generally a pretty poor medium for historical complexity. The danger is that a 2-hour movie designed primarily for entertainment and profit is swallowed whole by the viewer as the absolute truth of what really happened. So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, whether you're reading a bestseller or watching a huge summer blockbuster, you really have to recognize the difference between a story meant to inspire and a nuanced historical investigation. History is a constantly evolving argument. If we judge it solely on how beautifully it's told or how useful it is to our modern politics, we strip away the vital, uncomfortable truths we actually need to learn from. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on, because how we choose to remember our past absolutely dictates the future we build. The next time you consume historical media, I want you to ask yourself, are you being asked to evaluate complex evidence, or are you just being recruited into a narrative? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and never stop looking closer.